I will now give the floor to the representatives of the North American region.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think there are two of us here, so I guess I'll go first. I've changed my intervention a couple of times listening to some of the comments that are made, so my intervention might be a little bit disjointed from what I originally intended to say. However, I will begin by saying I would like to thank the President of the General Assembly for calling this important meeting. We also acknowledge the 4 advisors that will play an important role in implementing the modalities resolution. We also thank the member states who have spoken and are contributing to this discussion, and we are listening very closely. We also acknowledge and support many of the previous statements made by Indigenous representatives, and particularly that of the GCG. I bring you greetings from the chiefs, clan mothers, faith keepers, men, women, and children of the 6 Nations Iroquois Confederacy, which we call the Haudenosaunee. These nations include the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, who reside on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border. We have a constitution that predates European contact, and we still live by that constitution today. We have treaties with a number of states in this room, and we continue to have nation-to-nation relationships with states. Even with the United Nations, we have had relations. This very building was built in the 1940s. The chiefs of the Haudenosaunee were asked to help lay the cornerstone of the headquarters building. It was an honor to do so and symbolized the foundation that Indigenous peoples are to the world. Today, we are here to lay another kind of cornerstone, the cornerstone to a process, to a nation-to-nation relationships that will culminate in an outcome document for a high-level plenary meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations. This meeting will lay the foundation for that process, which will bring Indigenous representatives and state representatives into contact for meaningful and productive negotiations that will add to the inclusiveness of this, the largest and most important world body. In another link to this building, it is the Haudenosaunee high steel workers who erected the steel frame of this building. Skywalkers, we are called. As we bolted together the girders and the beams as this building went skyward, our skill and lack of fear of heights helped make this building possible. So today we are back to build another kind of frame, a framework for a better life for Indigenous peoples through participating in deliberations of the United Nations. Piece by piece, floor by floor, upward to the sky, we will make our aspirations into reality. The sky is the limit. So with this history, we are here to exercise the next level of engagement here in the United Nations. We look forward to meeting states to discuss an outcome document about our peoples. We expect states will use this process as a best practice in coming to agreements with Indigenous peoples. I'd like to repeat what we said in last week during a permanent forum, particularly after the statements, some of the statements by states today and by the President of the General Assembly. We have deep concerns about any process that follows informal consultations in the formula or the roadmap. According to our understanding, states will have the opportunity to make objections to the agreed text and start another series of negotiations without our participation. This is extremely disconcerting to us. The history of agreements between Indigenous peoples and states are fraught with broken promises and broken treaties. The mistrust between Indigenous peoples and states runs deep, and we are extremely wary of traps and ambushes that states have used in the past and continue to use today. This is a worst practice of states. The high-level plenary meeting is supposed to identify, quote, best practices on the realization of the rights of Indigenous peoples, unquote, according to the UN resolution that created this meeting. Now the states of the United Nations have the opportunity to demonstrate a best practice by having good faith negotiations with Indigenous peoples and honor any agreed text in the informal negotiations to produce an effective and uplifting outcome document. States should agree not to change any text agreed to by consensus with Indigenous representatives. Attempts by states to challenge any agreed text through this procedure is the continuing worst practice of states. In order for us to participate in this high-level plenary meeting, we need assurances that we will not be betrayed by states who will use the intergovernmental process to circumvent any consensus between indigenous peoples and states. So to continue, the foundation of the process is based on the understanding that indigenous peoples are peoples and equal to all other peoples. All our rights flow from this universal understanding. The framework of this process is that all indigenous peoples have a right to self-determination and are free to pursue their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. In that framework, like the steel frame that holds this building together, all our other rights are enclosed, including our right to have our own governments, to make treaties with other governments, and to interact in a nation-to-nation basis with other nations. We believe that our treaties with other nations are international in status, and our negotiations in this process will continue in that tradition. This is an intergovernmental process, and it is only rightful that we sit here with states to negotiate as governments. We support the objectives of the ALTA outcome document and support that the text be the basis of the discussions for the outcome document of the high-level plenary meeting called the UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. At this point, we are here to listen to what states have to say about their objectives, and we are willing to work with states which support our rights, goals, and aspirations. In this vein, we would like to suggest that this meeting be more open to not just to indigenous peoples who represent regions, but to indigenous peoples who are here in their own right of self-determination to represent the people they are from. They have come from long distances and made commitments and may have comments that will enhance the dialogue between indigenous peoples, the PGA, the advisors, and the states in this room, and add to the concise, action-oriented document. This meeting is just the beginning of a long and important process, and we will make our views better known as the process continues. We welcome the challenge of participation in this into this process. From laying the cornerstone and the steel of this building, now the foundation of our rights and participation inside of the United Nations begins. We look forward for staying inside the UN at this level, and the concise, action-oriented outcome document should keep indigenous representation at the highest level of the UN. These are our first words in this process, and we'll have further words in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gracias al
I thank the representative of the North American region.
Representative from North America? Okay, may I suggest, please, following the advice of the PGA, that you concentrate on ideas on the outcome document, please? Thank you.
Mr. President, Chinka Shanesh Yanyani Shuhat Duasok, Hatsu Shana Ye, Tekwadia Yahat, Katsit Hatsite. My name is Will Micklin, and I am First Vice President of the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska. That is an historical and traditional indigenous government representing over 29,000 of our Tlingit and Haida Indians, who are indigenous peoples and our tribal citizens from our traditional territories of Southeast Alaska. This statement is made on behalf of 129 tribal nations and 21 associations of tribal governments in the United States. For the past 2 years, including by interventions offered at the 12th and 13th Annual Permanent Forums on Indigenous Issues, we have proposed 4 recommendations for action to achieve the objectives of the World Conference. Today, no country in the world opposes the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet, regrettably, 7 years after its adoption by the UN General Assembly, the Declaration is having little effect on curbing violations of indigenous peoples' rights. We propose the following recommendations for inclusion in a concise, action-oriented outcome document to further the recommendations of General Assembly Resolution 66/296. Number 1, an implementing body for the UN Declaration. Decide to create an implementing and monitoring body with a mandate to promote and monitor implementation of the Declaration and to encourage compliance with the obligations expressed in the Declaration. Such a monitoring and implementation body should have a mandate to receive relevant information, to share best practices, to make recommendations, and otherwise to work toward the objectives of the declaration. The body should be made up of expert members, including indigenous experts. The General Assembly should establish a process by which would include indigenous peoples' representatives for elaborating the structure and mandate of such a body or mechanism at the earliest possible time. Number 2, combating violence against indigenous women and children with 3 actions. Number 1, decide to convene a high-level conference to examine challenges to the safety and well-being of indigenous women and children, and to share perspectives and best practices on the realization of the rights of indigenous women and children under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples with respect to protection against all forms of violence and discrimination. Number 2, decide to require that a UN body for monitoring and implementing the declaration give particular attention, or at least an annual basis, to the rights and special needs of indigenous women, youth, and children in the implementation of the UN Declaration. And number 3, decide to appoint a special rapporteur to focus exclusively on human rights issues of indigenous women and children, including but not limited to violence against them, and on changing state laws that discriminate against them. Number 3, recommendation number 3, an appropriate status for indigenous peoples within the United Nations. Create a distinct and appropriate status for indigenous peoples within the United Nations system in order to regularize and facilitate the participation of indigenous peoples in the work of the United Nations. Such a status within the UN system must give appropriate recognition to indigenous peoples represented by their own governments. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, or the Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in consultation with states and indigenous peoples, should be given responsibility for elaborating a resolution on this matter for adoption by the General Assembly at the earliest possible time. Recommendation number 4, action to protect rights to religious and cultural places. Take priority action to protect indigenous people's rights to their religious and cultural sites, and recommend particularly that the World Conference request the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Human Rights Council, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, gather and share relevant information and best practices, conduct expert meetings and interactive panels, prepare studies, issue reports, and make concrete recommendations for the implementation of indigenous people's right to maintain, protect, and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites, and to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies. The recommended implementing and monitoring mechanism for the UN Declaration, when it is created, should also give priority attention to the protection of indigenous people's religious and cultural sites. Similar recommendations have been made by other indigenous peoples and regions worldwide, including but not limited to the ALTA outcome document. We call on states to adopt these recommendations for inclusion in the outcome document by the World Conference. We also urge other indigenous peoples to join us in supporting the recommendations. Today, authorized representatives of tribal nations wish to offer interventions for each of our 4 priorities. We respectfully request, time permitting, that Your Excellencies permit our representatives to offer brief interventions on each of our specific recommendations, beginning with Chief Darwin Hill of the Haudenosaunee Nation. Thank you, Mr. President. Ankhlain Galashish, Galashish.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, sir.